lava, bulavinaka, Maori, hello, bonjour everyone. My name is Karen Mapusua. I'm the Director for the Land Resources Division of the Pacific Community, amongst other things. And I'm very happy to welcome you to what is a critically important discussion about resilience and food security. In particular today, we're talking about what's happening in the space of food security assessments and projects and some of the outcomes on the ground. This is part of a webinar series, as you know, on the framework for resilient development in the Pacific and is pulled together by the Pacific Resilience Partnership. So the partnership's been hosting a series of webinars since October 2020 on all sorts of topics in relation to resilience, including internal displacement, humanitarian actions, and of course, COVID. But today's all about food. It's an important thing for all of us. And we'll be discussing a wide range of topics from research outcomes to assessment tools and methodologies to the impact of some of these interventions on people in our communities. It's a timely discussion with the Global Food System Summit on the horizon, and with COVID-19 bringing such a sharp lens to both the strengths and the weaknesses of our food systems, and asking us to think about a whole new range of possible disruptors beyond natural disasters and climate-related disasters. Today we've got 6 guests and each will have 5 or 6 minutes to speak, and at the end we'll have time for questions and discussion. I ask you to please put your questions into the chat as we go through each speaker, and our secretariat will field these, and at the end our speakers will be able to respond to your questions. You didn't join this webinar to listen to me, so without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Ponu Stephen Hazelman. He's currently the Organic Systems Extension Officer with POETCOM, the regional organic network. And Stephen's been instrumental in setting up the Pacific seat at the UN World Committee on Food Security through its civil society mechanism for the Pacific. And he's currently the Pacific convener for the Intercontinental Network of Organic Farmers Organizations. Steve has established participatory guarantee systems for organic certification across the region and is working really hard to ensure that not only economic gains are realised through the organic certification, but to ensure that environmental and social responsibility is maintained and sustained. So Steve will discuss the promotion of organic agriculture, including how it links to preservation and revitalisation of traditional methods, and has resulted in some tangible shifts towards increased biodiversity and food security in the region. Steve, I'll hand it over to you. You're muted, Steve. Can you just unmute? Still muted, Stephen. Can you find it? Lower left-hand corner. Secretariat, is there any way to unmute Stephen from your end? Oh, okay. Okay, look, I think what we'll do while Steve is sorting out his technical problems, maybe we can move to the next presenter. And we'll get back to Stephen in a couple of minutes, if that's okay. So the next presenter is Gibson Susumu. Gibson, if you can get your screen ready to share. Gibson hails from the Federated States of Micronesia and is the program leader for sustainable agriculture within the SPC's Land Resources Division. In this role, he oversees crop production, farming systems, climate smart agriculture, seed systems, animal health and production, pests, disease management, and extension services. Fairly busy man. Prior to this role, Gibson was the Food Security Officer for LRD, and he was involved in the development of Climate Change and Food Security Framework, which has supported the development of some of the programs currently being implemented by the division, such as the Pacific Seeds for Life. Gibson holds a master's degree in science in agriculture from Taiwan, and Gibson will discuss participatory community-based approaches to building resilient agriculture in the Pacific. Okay, Gibbs, over to you.
Thank you, Karen, for the nice introductions. And Pula Vinaga, everyone. Today, as been mentioned, I'll be discussing SPC's community-based climate change and food security vulnerability assessment framework in informing programming and policy interventions, especially within SPC. Now, this framework is really intended for national extension services to enable them to empower communities across the region to understand the sector vulnerabilities and be able to identify and prepare and implement adaptation options with respect to climate change and food security, especially at the community level. Now, why extension services? Now, from SBC's experience, there is a growing realization that there is an increasing demand on expanded functions of extension services to play multiple roles, including addressing climate change and food security issues. Now, there are a range of frameworks out there, but oftentimes it's a bit difficult to really relate to some of these frameworks. So SPC has developed this framework really as a field manual to enable these extension services to carry out these multiple functions. Now, we have piloted this framework across 20 communities in 10 countries in the region. And most recently, at the Quechua consultations in Nandi back in 2017, some of you probably were there. And you will recall that the countries recommended SPC to go ahead and finalize this framework and distribute to countries for their use, especially in looking at mainstreaming climate change and food security within their adaptation framework. Now, this is the framework, the diagram on the left. As you can see, it's a 5-step process using various tools to assess exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity of communities and as well as their farming systems. Now, the beauty of this approach is that it allows not only to triangulate with scientific data, but enable extension services to be able to delve deeper into finding what are the root causes of the vulnerabilities within the farming systems across the various communities. Now, the other beauty of this framework is that it enables us to be able to establish vulnerability indices at the community level. Now, some of the key findings, especially at the with respect to drivers of climate change and food security that has been documented from these studies are shown on your screen. First, related to climate change and natural hazards. Now, the beauty of, again, the approach is that we were able to work with the communities and extension services to prioritize what are the most important issues confronting to climate to communities with respect to climate change and food security. Now, the other thing that has been very well documented from this assessment is that there is a really close linkage in comparing scientific data with respect to climate variabilities to the changing behaviors of plants and animals at the community levels. Now, the other thing is really looking at other issues confronting and the agricultural production and food security challenges at the communities with respect to non-climatic factors. The consistent findings across these communities is related to soil health, water issues, availability and access to diverse genetic resources for both plant and animals, and growing concerns around increasing incidences of pests and diseases. Now, at the socioeconomic issues, the consistent findings across this assessment is related to diet diversity and as well as reliance on imported food. Now, interestingly, in some of these really remote communities, you'll be surprised to look at data that although access to market and other food supply chains is an issue, there is a tendency of growing reliance on food documented from 40 to 60% at the very most remote communities. This is a really growing concern, especially when the Pacific is very vulnerable to market shocks and so forth. Now, the other one is on markets. Now, access to markets is also an issue across these communities, which can
Wait a
then
second, Steve, sorry.
impact income and livelihood and needs of these communities. Now, let me just touch on a few examples of how SPC is responding to some of these findings from these community-based assessments. Now, through these assessments, we were able to establish really targeted research needs across some of these communities. Now, I'll use Atoll as an example. Through partnership with ACR and various universities from Australia, we were able to address some of the targeted research needs for the atolls to address some of the ongoing production constraints. Now, through this exercise or through this collaboration, the Fed is now coming in to scale up some of this work. Another example is the SPC Pacific Seeds for Life. A growing concern is around availability and access to seeds, contributing to the vulnerability of both farming systems and as well as diversity of diet. Now, to respond to this issue, SPC is now developed a new integrated program called Pacific Seeds for Life, with funding support from MFAD and in partnership with Manaki Wenua Land Care Research New Zealand. We have now a 4.8 million to look at establishing and operationalizing sustainable systems in countries. Now, the last example I want to touch on is that using this participatory approach, we were able to gather evidence to inform policy change. Just recently, a new CSA plan has been developed, or climate smart agriculture plan has been developed for Nauru. So again, community-based approach can inform not only programming, but as well as policy support. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gibson, and sorry to bully you at the end. Please, everyone, remember to put your questions in the chat, and we are now ready to go to Stephen. So if we can stop the screen share, and Stephen, if you're now able to start your presentation, please.
Hello, you can hear me?
Yep, and if the Secretariat can share the screen, please. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, thank you very much, and apologies for that mishap. Yeah, I'm Steve Hazelman. I work for the Pacific Organic and Ethical Trade Community of SPC. We have 56 members in 17 countries. We started this work to promote organics in 2004. And at the back of our minds was that organics as a means to, of course, earn income, but also to keep the Pacific region green, blue, clean and safe. And just looking back at all the talk now about Blue Pacific and all this, it's interesting to note how this is revolving to make sure that our part of the globe is still green and blue, I suppose. Yeah, so the organic work has principles, and if the Secretariat could share the next slide. Are you seeing the next slides? Yeah, so organics have principles, and they're all there in the organic world. There are 4 principles, and we are the in the Pacific, we have put in the final fifth principle of culture and tradition, noting traditional farming systems and so forth. So in all of the organic work, and you see there in the principle, it's all about conservation and safeguarding our resources. Next slide, please. Yeah, so you'll find in the world of organics, there are two ways, third-party organic systems and the participatory guarantee system that we have spread around the region that will guarantee. And I suppose the importance of this is that for resilience, if farmers are not doing resilient practices, then this sort of motivates them or maybe police them a little bit to ensure that they are doing resilient organic practices and so forth to safeguard the resources. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then just to conclude, I suppose with some of the farmers who are working with the, it encourages the, to have all that diversity, because if you do not adhere to the rules of the game, then you're not sustained. And I'll give you an example of Rambi, where in Fiji, where we're just doing the organic certification, but it has resulted in massive replanting because of the effect of the cover, the price of cover going up. The result is clearing of massive land areas, which results in siltation of the streams, erosion, and loss of genetic resources. And also, so the whole systems sort of bring in the holistic approach to working in these communities. Just to say a little bit about soil, the way to understand it is to say that soil is in three parts: chemistry, physics, and biology. And then ever since doing agriculture, we were focusing solely on the chemistry of the soil, and unfortunately it was just NP and K, NP and K, NP and K. Now the soil physical structure for water holding capacity, for example, and all that kind of stuff was neglected. And more importantly, the life of soil that is underneath the soil, the biology of the soil becomes very important. Yeah, so all that is important. One thing with what we're finding with all this work that everyone is doing about raising the profile of traditional food, with the modern shows, modern twist, it seems to lift the acceptance of traditional foods, which leads to what's in the farm, the multi-sector, multi-crop agroforestry systems, which in one of the first slides, if somebody have studied the people who have lost their jobs and gone back to the villages, and you wonder why, it's because there's the community part, the people nature that they feel secure with, and of course there's the food, this security for food. And if you look at the farming systems, is what has sustained us up to now, I suppose. And I guess my last point is, okay, we have all these food and all the stuff that we have. How do we ensure the linking to health? Because you can, every time NCD comes up, say let's put in gardens, but it does not necessarily mean that you have the best garden, you won't get sick and you won't get overweight and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, so I think the work in organics, promoting the sustainability of rural communities and so forth. And just another point about this trade. Everybody is pushing for trade, but you got to really go back. For example, Taveuni at one time $30 million worth of taro, but what's the effect of that? Whole deforestation, soil erosion, loss of biodiversity, and all that kind of thing. So it needs to be a balance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve. and thank you for keeping to time. So our next presenter is Jessica Renery. She's a Senior Nutrition Sensitive Agriculture Advisor to ACR and also the Agriculture Development and Food Security section of Australia's DFAT. Jessica is a nutrition and food system specialist with experience spanning from leading research for development projects and programs to advising large development projects and decision makers on best bet interventions and entry points for improving nutrition. So Jessica today will present on an assessment of nutrition transitions and diet quality, comparing 3 different places and populations in the Solomon Islands. I'm happy to hand over to Jessica. You're muted, Jess.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Good, thank you.
Hello?
Yes, you're clear now, Jessica.
Yep, you can hear me? Okay, great. Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you as well.
Okay,
and
good.
your presentation.
All right, great. Okay, so good morning, everyone, or good afternoon at this point. So today I'm just going to give you a quick presentation on some results from a study we did in the Solomon Islands that was published early this year. Okay, all right. So the Solomon Islands are experiencing a syndemic, which is basically the coexistence of different challenges, including overnutrition, undernutrition, and non-communicable diseases, as well as climate change. Now, our study looked at diets within 3 geographically distinct food systems: a rural coastal village on Rendover Island, a rural inland village on eastern Guadalcanal, and an urban area around Hanoi. And what we found was that BMI and body fat percentage indicators were showing really quite a high prevalence of overweight and obesity in all areas, but even more so in the urban context, which might really not be too much of a surprise. We saw that only about 17% of participants were achieving minimum diet diversity. So that means at least 5 food groups were consumed out of a possibility of 10. And this is indicating that a high percentage of participants were unlikely to achieve micronutrient adequacy. Now, this is extremely low and is quite worrying. The majority, so over 3/4, I think, of rural participants actually achieved the WHO recommendations of consuming more than 400 grams of fruit and vegetable in a day, compared to just over 40% in urban populations. And that is really quite a high percentage compared to other figures that we see globally. But even though fruit and vegetable intake was reasonable, micronutrient intakes were still poor across the board. And perhaps it's not surprising given that diet diversity was so poor itself. And the main problem nutrients that we found were calcium, B12, folate, vitamin A, and iron in that order. Now, dietary species richness, which is a measure of both biodiversity and diet quality, and its a count of the number of species that are consumed in the diet, was significantly higher in rural populations compared to urban. And interestingly, we found that the number of species consumed was positively correlated with the amount of wild and cultivated foods in both urban and rural diets. And this tells us that agrobiodiversity is important for diets. However, this is at risk because we also saw a significant decline in the total dietary energy that was sourced from these foods, particularly among younger participants compared to older participants who were, and the younger participants instead were consuming more store-bought foods. Again, perhaps not so much of a surprise. Now, this provides us insights into the changing trends in how food systems are functioning. We have more reliance on store-bought foods in younger people's diets than older generations. And this is potentially putting agrobiodiversity within our food systems at risk and the health of the people of the Pacifics as a result. Now, compared to other studies that looked at ultra-processed foods across the world, the contribution of ultra-processed foods in the Solomon Island diets is still relatively quite low. On average, they were making about contributing to about 12% of diets. However, ultra-processed foods were consumed exponentially according to the proximity of participants living to urban centres, where 18% of their diets were consumed with these foods. So what does this tell us? Rural diets are slightly more diverse than urban ones. They have more vegetables and less processed foods, yet nutrient intakes were much less. And when we look at total energy intakes, we see why. Rural populations were either not getting enough food or only just. And in that sense, I'm talking about overall energy intake here. So that gives us an insight that rural populations need to eat more of the foods they already eat, diversify as much as possible, and in particular, increase protein and animal source foods. Now, urban areas showed a higher prevalence of less healthy diet characteristics, including significantly less of the population consuming enough fruit and vegetables, and significantly more consuming ultra-processed foods. Now, both of these dietary trends are correlated with a higher incidence of non-communicable diseases, including overweight and obesity. So urban populations need to slightly decrease the total energy intake and replace high energy foods with more nutrient dense foods such as fresh fruit, vegetables and protein. Now, the Solomon Islands is a biodiversity hotspot. It has a vast biological genetic diversity, rich cultural and traditional knowledge, and all of these are valuable assets for resilient and sustainable food systems. We've talked about biodiversity already in the past 3 presentations, so I think we can say that, you know, across the Pacific, biodiversity is important. So how can we achieve a more diversified diet by utilising this resource? Now, just to conclude, if you open any one of the big global reports on food and nutrition security, go to the national tables, and without a doubt, you'll be met with NAs for most of the Pacific. This is an example of a table from the SOPI report from last year. Now, this lack of data leads decision makers often scratching their heads about what are the best bet entry points and where can we target food and nutrition security interventions where they're needed most. Now, anecdotally, those of us that live and work within the region know the situation, which generally isn't great. The region is battling with chronic food insecurity and malnutrition. The kinds of sub-national and site-specific studies that many of us are presenting here today, including me, provide evidence-based snapshots into these realities, which is really helpful. But what we really need is timely, national and sub-nationally representative data. One positive of COVID is that we're seeing an increased interest on collecting more nationally and sub-nationally representative data using mobile technology. And I know Andre is going to present their MVAM results later on, which is fantastic. And these methodologies are collecting really important insights, and however, they aren't without their challenges. And one in particular is being the timely publication of results that allows decision makers to be able to respond in close to real time, and particularly important when acute food insecurity issues arise. Now, unfortunately, in the given climate, which shows increasing incidence of, COVID and climate change risks, this is only increasingly likely to occur. And I just wanted to say that DFAT is currently working on developing a concept note that will focus on supporting more efficient coordination of national and sub-national representative Pacific food security assessments. It hopes to facilitate country-level capacity building to routinely collect and report the kind of food security data that can help decision makers respond appropriately to food insecurity needs in our region in a more timely manner. So I'll leave it there. Timekeeper, I think I have kept to my allocated time, and thank you all for your patience.
Thanks very much, Jessica. That was really fascinating. Moving on now to our next speaker, and remember, please, any questions for Jessica in the chat. Introducing Lau William-Moyese, who's a research fellow for the Climate Change, Food Security and Disaster Risk Management at the Pacific Center for Environment and Sustainable Development at our university, USP. He has 22 years of experience in research on food security and resilience, and coordinates 3 postgraduate courses on food security and climate change, disaster risk reduction for resilience, and disaster response and recovery. Vili will share the outcomes of a study on the impacts of COVID-19 mitigation measures and interventions on food systems in 13 communities from Fiji and Solomons. Over to you, Billy.
Thank you very much. Karen, can you hear me?
Yes, you can.
Oh,
Very
okay. Perfect. Yeah, I am speaking on behalf of a very large team between organizations who put a lot of resources on this. Yeah, and we conducted a research with partners to investigate the impacts of COVID-19 mitigation measures, such as lockdowns and social distancing, as well as the impacts of COVID-19 intervention measures implemented, such as planting of crops and also those budgetary allocations. On the diets, livelihood, health, education, and water, food system, food security of communities, urban and rural communities, formal and informal communities in Fiji and the Solomon Islands. You can read all about the details of the studies in the two technical reports here. And the links are, I think, also on the chat area. And if you read, you need to contact me, please do so. But I also just briefly mentioned that COVID-19 amplifies pre-COVID-19 situations, both in terms of vulnerabilities and also resilience in our communities. It's seen in the graphic up there that the mitigation measures were successful in reducing the arrival and the spread of COVID-19 virus in our Pacific Island countries. So well done for that. However, there were many negative implications as they increased the hardship households faced, and it affected their income, diets, spending more times to get water. The women spend more times. They also become teachers and tutors for their children during lockdowns. And there's a lot of impacts on the environment, as we heard before. And in terms of COVID-19 interventions, there were a lot of interventions happening. And the way the interventions happened, they were more like responding to extreme measures like cyclones because of the impacts of cyclone during the time. And the national governments, NGOs, regional organizations, all development partners, faith-based organizations did a lot of work to reduce the impacts of COVID-19. So well done for that as well. As you see here on the right, there are a lot of positives, and it's also mentioned earlier, increased production, increased sizes of gardens, and it was very good, but I am also very proud of how our communities utilize the culture of resilience, or more of going back to those communal values of looking after each other, love thy neighbor, sharing the land and resources in order to support each other. But those mechanisms also have their limits because you can only keep what you have. If you keep too much, you're putting yourself at risk. And sometimes the safety net will become the risk net. So negatively, I think there are two important things just to demonstrate the lack of these holistic approaches is that the interventions were mainly on production, but there was a lack of consideration of future seasonal forecasts or the climatic conditions and the social challenges at the community level. So people just kept planting things, but when the flood came, all gone, or the drought conditions as well. And there was a decline in diversity of foods consumed at the household level. The dietary diversity reduced from about 3 to 4 food groups before COVID-19 to after, to about 2 to 3 after COVID-19 or during COVID-19. So it's important to consider that solving one, not causing another problem. So, these critical elements are very important for us to consider. Food security itself sounds very complex because it is a complex system. It has many pillars, dimensions, conflicting priorities, and addressing one might lead to either more complications or making some positive progress. So what I am trying to say is that we do need to understand food security as an outcome or more of also a process within the food system approach and a holistic systemic approach at a household level, because there are no sectors at the household level. Everything is connected there. And the University of South Pacific We do have campuses, 14 campuses, 12 countries, and we also have researchers in 15 Pacific Island countries. So there is capacity there, and it's good to work together with your national universities, your national research institutions, and working with the partners. So it's important as well to work with within the local capacity, because COVID-19 has shown that we do need to localize not only humanitarian action, but also research and conducting this assessment. So building that capacity through your universities and also involving your youth is very important. But we also need to look at the context here. I put Ben Ryan's famous beautiful chaos strategy there, because when he came and he implemented a beautiful chaos, he did not change the way the Fijian players play rugby. He just ironed out and identified those critical things like better nutrition, better rest, better decision making, and that's come from good understanding and assessment and research, and added that with what Aristotle said, that in order to understand the system, well, we need to break it down to the components and study it. But to solve the solutions, to provide the solutions, we need to bring them together, because the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Also, food security is a human security issue, because a hungry human is a very angry human. You don't want to face a very hungry one. But to end it here, I just want to bring to your attention the value of research, and it brings a lot of multi-dimensional understanding and addressing things in a much more holistic way. And we need to work within strategic partnerships. These are the partners that were involved in the study. The links are there, and we include the students as well, because they are our future leaders. So let's use the lessons learned, reimagine, reconnect, and work together, but do not forget the researchers. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sorry for taking a bit longer, Karen.
That's fine. Thanks, Billy. Great. Moving along to our next presenter, who is Angela Burch, the Program Manager, and she does M&E for the Pacific Islands Farmer Organisation Network, or PIFON. She's responsible for ensuring that the impact of activities conducted by PIFON members are reported to reflect the great work that farmers' organisations are doing. Angela came from a background in tourism before venturing into an exciting new chapter in agriculture. I agree with that description, Angela. And Angela will share what PIFON activity areas are that are aiming at increasing food and nutritional security through value chain work in particular. Thank you, Angela. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Karen. Sorry, I'm just trying to get the share screen up. Right. Okay. Pacific greetings from the Pacific Islands Farm Organizations Network. PIFON is grateful to the PRP for this opportunity to share the work that some of our farmer organizations are undertaking in their respective countries. We work with 23 farmer organizations. Sorry. I think my screen is not working. One moment, please. There we go. Thank you. We work with 23 farmer organizations across 9 countries, namely the Cook Islands, Papua New Guinea, New Caledonia, Samoa, the Solomon Islands, Timor-Leste, Tonga, Vanuatu, and Fiji. Currently, we are the regional implementation agency for an EU-funded project called FO for ACP. And we work with EFAD, and this program focuses on food and nutritional security, as well as improving livelihoods. Just to give you a summary of activities that have taken place since the implementation of the program, we've got 18 farmer organizations with whom we work who have conducted 367 activities across the 9 countries. This has seen more than 14,000 participants involved, of which over 7,700 are females and over 4,000 are youth. The effects of COVID-19 in the Pacific have been compounded by natural disasters. We've had volcanic ash in Vanuatu, tropical cyclones, we've had flooding. However, our farmer organizations have kept to their core activities with some modifications to respond to the given situation. Activities have included training in farming practices, labor-saving tools, access to planting materials, land preparation, agro-processing, policy advocacy, safety measures, of course, given the situation we are in with the COVID-19 pandemic. There has been some regional work on breadfruit, which is a climate resilient crop aligned to Pacific food and nutritional security. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to focus on two of our farmer organizations. One is in the Solomons and the other is in Fiji, and just look at the programs, one of the programs they're each running in their respective countries. We moved to the Solomons, where Custom Garden Association was asked by a secondary school, Vanonu Secondary School in the Western Province near Giza, to establish a model farm. The school's location has been identified as highly vulnerable to drought, and the farm was part of its COVID-19 response plan. Aside from being a learning tool for its agricultural class students, the farm would also supply vegetables for the school kitchen to promote nutritional diets and enjoy savings as well on food purchases. So KGA designed the model farm. They helped train the teachers and the students to manage the nursery and the farm, and they also supplied about 460 packets of seed. You can see from the screen, cabbage, beans, sweet corn, and cucumber. And also part of the package was Makuna beans to help with the natural rejuvenation of the soil as we're looking at promoting sustainable agriculture. In just 3 months, the school was already saving on the supply of cabbage and beans, and from their initial harvest, they established a seed saving program, and this will continue to expand. And when the farm is at full production, excess produce will be sold to the neighboring communities. We now move to Fiji, where Bula Agro ran a program called Tell a Woman, or the TAL program. It was launched shortly after COVID. And in brief, the program involved identifying women who were either farmers or avid backyard gardeners who represented different communities across the country. And they undertook training in soil preparation, raising seeds and seedlings, open pollinated seeds, pest management, and composting. They were also encouraged to use items from around the home to help develop their gardens, their nurseries, their farms. So this included discarded milk cartons, plastic items, the cardboard inserts from the toilet rolls. In just 4 weeks from inception, a core group of 8, there was a core group of 8 that undertook the initial training, and just 4 weeks from inception, 4 of them had already started training within their communities. So they were sharing information, they were sharing planting material within their communities. To finish off our presentation, I would like to share a video of one of the core trainers. She's an avid backyard gardener, and she's had to relocate to her home island of Taveuni in Fiji, but I'll let her tell you a little more. At this time, I'd like to thank everyone for their time. Pinaka.
The sound isn't very good on the video, and given that we are almost out of time, I'm afraid we might just have to pause the video at this point in time. I don't think we're getting good enough sound.
Sorry about that. Okay.
Yeah.
Stop share.
Yep. Thank you, Angela. Sorry about that. It would have been good to see.
Sorry about that.
Yep, no problem. It wouldn't be a webinar without a few technical challenges, that we know, so that's fine. So thank you very much to Pifon, and we'll move now to our last presenter, Andre, who is the Vulnerability Analysis and Mapping Officer at the World Food Programme, where he works to enable data-driven coordination and decision-making. And his work has led to the scale-up of remote monitoring through the Vulnerability Analysis and Mapping Initiative, which collects key food security indicators in 5 countries and tracks the situation of households over time. Andre will give us a brief presentation on these efforts. Thank you, Andre.
Hi, thank you, Karen. So my presentation's on mobile vulnerability analysis and mapping, which is an initiative to track key food insecurity indicators as well as livelihood indicators. This is done in countries, and it includes understanding what ends up on households' dish, essentially what their consumption looks like with a 7-day recall. And it also collects information on ways that households deal with hardship and some of the strategies that have negative impacts on the household, and as well as debt, remittances, and overall levels of deprivation. So lack of access to basic and essential needs. This is done remotely. So we hire call centers to place calls randomly on a sample based geographically, and that sample is national. So I will say that the evidence that's generated is meant to drive coordination at the food security clusters nationwide and regionally. And so I will share actually how that's evolved over time, and I think that'll be a very interesting point of discussion. So I'll now zoom in from just the overall MVEM initiative to just Fiji, and highlight some of the findings that we've had prior to TC YASA and ANA. And we see ongoing high risk of iron deficiency, which is a worrying trend in that 50% of children in Fiji are considered to be anemic. We also see that, again, the big picture here is that not all households are affected in the same way. We found that female-headed households tend to adopt negative coping strategies, and these have impacts on their well-being in the short, mid, and long term. We've also seen that food prices has really shot up to the #1 worry and concern for families. So there's something there about markets, right, that should be uncovered. And also we found that there's a positive correlation or relationship between debt and food insecurity. So those households that tend to borrow for food and health tend to be food insecure. So again, this is a national monitoring system. So it is not designed to track subnational level trends. But with that said, post-TC, YASA, and ANA has revealed some interesting findings. We have found that food insecurity increased for all types of households, but has been more pronounced for female-headed households and for households with children aged 4 and younger. We've really seen food prices actually increase as a concern nationally to 59%. So again, something there about markets and post-hazard situation, right? Even more worrisome is that crisis level of coping strategies increased by 12% up to 21%. So more households are relying on very high levels of asset depletion that will impact their ability to come back from these impacts in the mid to long term. We saw remittances increase actually, but also reduction of income or no income actually increased, and it increased not equally. It actually affected women and households with children aged 4 or younger at higher rates. So finally, just to close, monitoring these hazards is important. We're working with the National Disaster Management Office and the Ministry of Agriculture to track a subnational sample of areas affected by TCS and TCANA. We're actually implemented a new sample filter so that we're able to control for the likelihood of overrepresenting more affluent households, which tends to happen with mobile interviews. This will also allow us, hopefully, this trial or pilot will allow us to see whether we can monitor food rations and see whether how these households differ from other households that did not receive food rations. And again, this is all built to be a rapid deployment that shows us results, and these results are already having an impact in the discussions being had, for example, in social protection by including nutrition-sensitive programming or advice and advocacy to key ministries within Fiji. So again, we're in many different countries, but just wanted to present this and the big picture, and happy to answer any questions and post my email on the comment box if you want to reach out to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andre, and special award for finishing 30 seconds early. Wonderful. Okay, thank you very much to all our presenters. It puts the pressure on to have only 5 minutes to talk through such an important subject. So opening the floor now to questions. And I'll just ask our Secretariat team if they have some ready for our presenters to respond to. Okay, we're looking at all of them. Okay, maybe the first one to Gibson. Do you have any specific example on how communities are applying the framework that you spoke about, and what has been their experience with its application? And if you can just be as succinct as possible, please, so we can fit a few questions in.
Yeah, thanks, Karen, and thank you, Moken, for the question. Well, as alluded to at the beginning of my presentation, the framework is really targeted for extension services, but it also empowers communities to really understand their vulnerabilities and be able to define adaptation measures within their own capacity. So that's the first realization, being able to understand the vulnerabilities and be able to define what adaptation options are there within their reach. And lastly is being able to empower the communities to communicate or advocate the issues to the national level, whether to inform planning or policy.
Okay. Naka Gibson. And the next one is directed to you also, Gibbs. Has the framework been received by the extension officers, and how has it assisted the implementation of climate adaptation measures, and any specific examples?
Right. Well, again, the participatory nature of the framework really first empowers the extension services to be able to conduct thorough or participatory assessment within the communities. Now, in doing so, it enables them to be able to really identify what sort of technical or advisory support services are needed so that they can respond to the community development needs, whether it's within agricultural development or through facilitation process. Yeah, I hope I understand that question. I mean, address that question.
Thanks, Gibson. Next question through for Stephen. Does the participatory certification system have the same standards as the third party?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. The participatory guarantee system that we are rolling out in the Pacific, we use a regionally developed Pacific Organic Standard, which is included in the IFOAM family of world standards. So we are using that for the Pacific. Now, for third party, we are developing a memorandum of understandings with third-party certifying bodies to also use our standard when they are working on certification for regulated markets like the US, the EU, Japan, China, Canada, South Korea, and so forth. Our standard have some unique features. If you need a copy, need your email. These inclusion of climate change inside, and also social inclusion, which is part of that. But the Pacific Organic Standard was written by Pacific Islanders to put forward how we farm in this region. And slowly, it's 12 years old now, and we are doing a review for it. But You know the differences between trying to get equivalences between countries in terms of standard. I hope you have answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. So another one back on Gibson's presentation, how the framework approaches social protection and economic empowerment, and if you have any examples related to market supply chains and what some of those challenges might be.
Yeah, so as I touched on again at the first part of my presentation, the framework employs various and a range of tools, and especially when assessing the adaptive capacity, we look at the range of areas, including governance, in terms of access to resources, in terms of so and so. And at the economic empowerment level, we also assess the 5 livelihood assets within the communities, and then look at what are the key issues confronting. So looking at financial assets and as well as market access issues. So again, identifying what sort of issues confronting the communities, so that proper adaptation options can, and I can use an example of Vanuatu. The main livelihood of a community that we assess, the main income source is copra, but because of shipping problems, they're not able to supply the quantities to affect regular shipping to the communities. And why? It's really because there's no proper storage and other infrastructure needed to bulk up to affect transportation, regular transportation to the island. So again, these are simple interventions, but can have a ripple effect on whatever interventions we can provide to the communities. Thanks.
Thanks. The next one is more general, so if any of our speakers would like to put their hand up for it, and it's a really interesting question. If education is supported and determined by the quality and quantity of food that one consumes, then why was it that agriculture and fisheries officers are acceptable to work at diploma level, unlike secondary school teachers who need a bachelor's degree before they can teach in schools? Does this mean that food at one time was less important than education, or are they equally important? Why and how? Anyone like to take that one on?
That's a tough one. Well, maybe I can try, and then others can complement. Again, I think food and nutrition is security issues is not a one sector kind of approach. It really requires multiple multi-layer approach. But to do that is really being able to define the entry points across the different stakeholders. Thanks. That would be my take on that particular question, and I hope I hit it right.
Thanks, Gibson. Billy, do you want to have a quick response as well?
Just a quick one. Thank you for the question. It's a very complicated question. Just quickly going through that, there is an assumption that in the Pacific, everybody is a good farmer and a good fisher. Everybody can grow a crop, can catch a fish, and can cook. So I think, but not everybody can be a teacher in a formal education meaning, because anybody can also be a teacher in the Pacific as well. So I think that assumption lead to those kind of inequality in terms of entry points for qualifications in the education system. So, but now we know that assumption is not right. So I think we need to address that. Thank you.
Thank you, Billy. We are on the hour now, so we will need to wrap up. I did notice one more comment in the chat, just noting that there was no speaker from the atoll countries and asking if there is different programs for the North Pacific. We have Gibson from the Federated States of Micronesia, who was a speaker, and also just to assure you that while some of the examples, or many of the examples, might have come from the southern region of the ocean, we've also had a lot of work done under these same programs in least on behalf of SPC, Pacific Community and POACOM, and I'm sure also USP, that work equally in the North Pacific. It was just maybe not so well defined in the discussion here today. So I'd like to thank everybody, thank our presenters very much for pulling together the amazing work that's been done in this region and sharing it so succinctly with everyone this morning. All our participants, I can see that there was people from all over the region, which is always really exciting. And I would also just like to thank our sign language interpreters. I think that's a fantastic initiative to have sign language happening on an event like this to make it all the more inclusive. And finally, the Pacific Resilience Partnership, of course, for pulling this all together and continuing the important conversation about resilience in our region. So thank you very much, everybody, and we will see you at the next event.